Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. Joan Silber has always been a superb writer. Her first book, Household Words, won a major award, the Hemingway Award. She's been one of the few writers who I can say I own all of in hardback because I bought the books immediately as they came out. I say that, although I probably don't own all the books in hardback because they've left my house. They're the kind of books you put into somebody's hands and loan them, and they never come back. Anyway, I've been reading Joan for years and years all along. This is her ninth. Her most recent book is her ninth book, and they're absolutely beautiful. But I've been reading all along, and in the midst of a flourishing career, something happened. The work changed, and all of a sudden, it reached another level. It was just these last 4 books, in my opinion, have been absolutely incandescent. And yet, all the books before them, I was reading with immense pleasure, and didn't feel that I didn't feel they needed any change, any jump, but there it was. And I've only really seen that once before, and that's in the career of Alice Munro, who was also always wonderful. But then at some point, just the stories became incredible. She's won basically every award there is, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Penn Faulkner, the Penn Malamud Award. There's no doubt that she's found her real form in these connected. She writes these connected short stories, which together span the globe and decades, and sometimes centuries of time. I mean, they're missionaries in the Boxer Rebellion, and they give the satisfactions of a novel. In fact, I think they are a new kind of novel that Joan Silber has created. So please welcome her. She's going to be reading from her new book, which is not yet out, and which will be called Mercy. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's a great joy for me to be here. You can all hear me okay? This is working? I'm going to read from, it will be part of my new novel, and it's been a story by itself called Evolution. And I'm going to, in the interest of not reading for hours and hours, I'm going to chop out parts of it and kind of explain what you missed and skip over things, but I hope it will all fit together. So the part that I'm skipping in the beginning has to do, it begins in 1974, and Kara is a girl of 10 living in Manhattan. And she has decided to show off for her friend who lives across the air shaft. And it's winter, and she's in her nightgown and bathrobe and dancing on the fire escape, just showing off for her friend, just being, like a show-offy girl. And in the course of doing it, because it's winter and the fire escape is slippery, it's been snowing, she skids and she hurts her leg quite badly and has to be taken to the emergency room of the local hospital, St. Vincent's Hospital on East 12th Street in the Village in New York. And the hospital is total chaos. The emergency room is chaos. And one of the things she sees when she's in this emergency room waiting to be waited on is 2 guys who have obviously done something with drugs, and one of them is totally passed out. And he is deserted by his friend while she's sitting around watching. And that's all we see of it, although it is featured in other parts of the novel. And she comes out of there sort of, it's a big adventure for her, and they put a cast on her leg, but she's also more aware of the dangers of the world, having been there. And then we're going to hop ahead to her as a teenager, and we're going to meet her now. She's 16, so it's 6 years later. I ran away with a boy when I was 16. He was 3 years older, and I was enormously flattered that he wanted me to run off with him. We didn't say we loved each other. We didn't bring that up. But my lust for him was great and constant. Lust was a big deal in the world around me. Most people believed in sex in a way that they don't quite anymore. Did we run that idea into the ground? Overplay it? I could not have been prouder of myself in those days to be following sex as my guiding light. I should have paid more attention to Brody, the boy in question. I was much too abstract in the way that I viewed him. We both worked at a donut shop on West 8th Street. Ronald, the owner, was never there and told me to do whatever Brody said. We both had the long weekend shifts, busy in the morning and dull in the late afternoon. And they are carrying on in the shop. I'm cutting off this point. I had slept with 2 other boys a few times each, so I knew something, but not that much, about the male anatomy. The male anatomy was still an unfolding mystery to me. From the get-go, my mother had said Brody was too old for me. And when she found out I was cutting school, I did it too many times, she banned him from our apartment and tried to get me to promise never to see him again, which wasn't even the sort of thing she did. Cutting school, she said, is the gateway to a lot of things I hate to have to think about. In fact, she was right about that. Brody had hardly ever talked about his family. His father drove a truck for the New York Post. That was all I knew. Brody's mother stayed home, so there was no sneaking off to his place. He made fun of my mother, called her the mouse mother because she worked in a library. They had met a few times when he came over, and it had gone okay, normal terse exchanges. He told her his favorite kind of books to read were true crime books. I like action and death, he said. True crime is a very popular genre, I said. Brody said I should just lie to her about seeing him. So I did. The only person who knew I had a secret life was Nini. Nini is the friend she was showing off for in the first scene. What scared her about Brody was the way he got money. At work, he sometimes rang up his own version of sales, but not too often. His other, more ambitious scam was stealing items from department stores and then returning them for cash. Once a cashmere sweater, once a silk shirt, once a watch. No one ever really goes to jail for that, I told Nini. They were allied in my mind, the new bodily thrills and Brody's lawlessness. Sometimes we smoked weed in the park. I was very adamant about not drinking. I thought civilization had advanced beyond alcohol, which made people violent, to more peaceful drugs like cannabis. An evolutionary change. Smoking pot made me nestle in Brody's arms on the park bench, curve against him in delight. By May, Brody had finished a year of community college, allegedly studying business administration, and he said he'd had it with school crap. Want to hitch to Arizona, he said. It wouldn't be hard. He had a friend there we could stay with. It was a good place to live, he'd heard. The great spaces of the desert. We had found a new place to have sex, Nini's bedroom, when her parents weren't home. He said this after a long, intricate session. My mother had said she hated me seeing me hang all over him like a doting idiot. And why wasn't he with someone his own age? Did I know how pathetic I looked, flinging myself at him? This insult had broken my loyalty to my mother. So I could go wherever I wanted, couldn't I? I'd never been farther away than Washington or Boston. My mother was horrified that I was so unlike the Kara she'd always known. But that was what elated me, the new depths I'd found in myself, my untapped capacities. I thought my mother had probably never had really good sex. Brody had ideas about what clothes I should bring to Arizona. It was early June in New York, not really hot yet, but we'd do better picking up rides if I brought some of the nice things I had that showed my figure. I was a small, skinny girl with a big bust, and he admired the sundress with the plunging neckline and the t-shirt that was tight and orange. Oh, also the ripped jeans with the rip near the crotch. We have to think ahead, he said. In the end, a friend of his drove us as far as the New Jersey Turnpike, and I stood by the highway in my little orange t-shirt and jeans, with Brody lurking behind a tree. How smug I felt when a large truck stopped right away, and Brody suddenly ran up to get in with me. The driver was an old, fat guy, and we squashed ourselves next to him by having Brody put me on his lap. My mother thought I was on a class trip to the Adirondacks. "You cozy?" the man said. He had a growly voice and snorted when he heard that we were heading all the way to Arizona. Did we know how far that was? "Watch out for the rattlesnakes," he said when he led us off 5 exits further. We had to wait much longer there, and the guy in a Ford van who finally stopped had me sit in the front and Brody in the back. And he patted my knee the whole way and began to stroke the zipper and put his finger into the rip spot. I didn't say a word. I thought it was my job to be polite and friendly. I got more worried as his hand got more insistent, and I had endured quite a lot by the time he let us off near Pennsylvania. Brody thought it was funny when I told him, and I said, "Oh, man." I was unhappy about it, but I wasn't frightened. Whatever happened was something I could put up with. Our next rides were guys who just wanted to talk, and Brody made up stories for them, different stories. We were going to Arizona so we could work on a date farm. We were going to Arizona to help manage his uncle's silver mine. We were going to Arizona to work in his grandmother's hotel, and I was going to sing in the hotel's restaurant. He had me sing for the driver. I could carry a tune okay, and I did Home on the Range and Muskrat Love without my voice cracking. I liked this part. And what were we going to do when night fell? How trusting I was. Brody had the driver drop us at a strip mall somewhere at the edge of Ohio, where a motel advertised rooms for $12 a night. He told the clerk we'd pay in the morning when we checked out, but the clerk said, "I don't think so." Brody said we were going to eat first and come back. I was starving and very glad to be chomping down on a fillet of fish at the nearby McDonald's. "It's the spot, doesn't it?" Brody said. We were going to be on the road for the next 3 or 4 days at least, he added, and we didn't have money for hotel rooms if we wanted to eat. We were eating indoors at McDonald's, but the Rancho Deluxe restaurant a few doors down had picnic tables outside. We had to wait till everything closed and we could sleep on the benches. No one would even see. It was a nice night, just a little chilly. I was only sorry that we'd have to sleep on separate benches. "What a great girl you are," he said. McDonald's didn't stay open much longer, and then Brody had us hike laps around the strip mall to keep us in our beautiful health. He carried the pack with our things in it, and we had our arms around each other's waists as we walked, and I was in a glorious moment of my life. We walked past the dark stores with neon signs still lit, and past a few eating joints whose brightness stayed on. The rancho took forever to close. We went around the mall any number of times. But then we rounded the corner and we saw it dark at last. Brody put a blanket down on a bench for me, and he settled himself on another bench, and we held hands under the table. Brody lit a roach, and we passed it back and forth. I fell asleep on that plank of wood like a passenger on a boat. But how were we ever going to have sex again if we never had a bed? Brody solved this for us one night, somewhere in Missouri, by deciding we could camp out at a rest stop behind a giant bush at the end of a parking lot. Though I had the blanket under me on the grass, once Brody got going, the pounding of the act was more than I wanted, and I wondered what aim of evolution was served by designating it this way. What force of nature wanted Brody's enthusiasm to leave welts on my back? When it got too bad, I shifted around so I was on top, which Brody liked fine, but I was already battered. And yet, I believed more than ever that we were nature's dearest creatures, its adepts, its glowing initiates. My battered self slept on Brody's chest. On the way to Oklahoma the next day, we had a creepy driver who told dirty jokes and laughed at the punchlines. It was her pussy all along. He didn't try to touch me, but he kept repeating the lines and grinning. When he dropped us off at a rest stop, I decided I had $9 in my wallet and we would spend for a motel. You are such a princess, Brody said. We're starting to smell, I said. Excuse me, Miss Royalty? We fought over this until I thought he really was going to sleep outside by himself, but in the end, he let me check us in. And I took a rapturous shower for so long that the hot water ran out on Brody, who had no interest in making love that night. Okay, if that was how he felt. I slept poorly and sadly, hearing the murmur and whistle of his breath. Our last day in Texas was steamy and hot and had one unpleasant incident. Brody tried to steal a pack of American cheese and 3 pepperoni sausages from a gas station grocery, and the guy followed us to the door and said, "People get shot for less." I was terrified. Brody said nothing and kept his head down as he gave up the goods. Arizona was thrilling to see outside the windows. There really were cacti, but it was midnight on a dark desert night by the time we got closer to Tucson, where his friend lived. "You won't mind our showing up so late?" We'd been let out at a bare strip of closed snack joints along the highway. There were 2 payphones, and one of them worked. Brody fed it all his change and dialed a number that rang and rang. And after what seemed like hours, I heard him say, "Russell? Yeah, it's me. Really, I told you." He wanted Russell to come pick us up, wherever we were, but Russell apparently wanted us to hitch to his house. So we stood with our thumbs out, but no vehicle of any kind was stopping at this hour. Brody got more change from me and went back to the payphone to call again. And in the wee hours of the morning, an old Dodge Dart came out of the black highway and stopped for us. "What an asshole you are," the driver said. He looked okay, skinny in his t-shirt, wearing a straw cowboy hat to keep out the sun later. "Russell, my man, good to see you," Brody said. "Who's the girl?" "Kara, isn't she cute?" "Not really," he said. I was in the back seat, they were in the front, and Brody looked back at me, scowling. "I don't even know you," Russell said, "and you've got me driving all over the state for you." They had met, by Brody's account, at a retreat in Nebraska that his high school, St. Somebody's, had had with another Catholic school. He and Russell had sneaked away from the Sylvan premises together and had been sent home in disgrace, thereby forming a lifelong bond, or so Brody had decided. "I'm so happy to be in Arizona," Brody said. "It just feels freer here, the air." I fell asleep in the car with the free air blowing on my head, and Brody woke me up later to walk me into a very small adobe house cluttered with furniture I couldn't see. I was put in an armchair to sleep, and I didn't wake up till bright daylight got me, and I could hear voices from what turned out to be a kitchen alcove. "The girl is awake," Brody said, looking over at me. The two guys were laughing about something, that was good, and eating toast, and Brody actually gave me a piece from his plate. I scarfed it down without even speaking. I hadn't known how hungry I was. Russell said I could finish the loaf if I went out for supplies afterwards with Brody. A 15-minute walk to the grocery store, and we could admire the scenery. I saw that Russell's cube of a house was one room with too many chairs in it. In the corner was a mattress with blue sheets, which seemed to be where Russell slept. "You know what I think," Brody said. "You know that retreat we were on? They were right about one thing." "Father Mike, don't remind me." He said that nature was how God revealed himself to us. Have you been outside yet? What kind of God wants it to go up to 97 by noon? Russell said, "Well, the great thing is this house has a swamp cooler. You know how they work? You're only sweltering a little, right?" "You've gotten very local," Brody said. I was still thinking about God and nature. I had my own secret theory that sexual feeling existed to impress on humans the sense of a beyond, the reality of another plane. There was no other reason for it to be the way it was. I certainly wasn't going to say any of it to Brody, though I'd once talked to Nini about it. I sort of loved the landscape, so flat you could see forever, with its cluster of houses, the vivid blue sky, and a horizon with mountains on one side. And I liked Little Bodega, where we pooled our money to get bread and peanut butter and hot dogs and milk. I felt sure that we could find jobs in this city. Russell worked in a Xerox store a few days a week. We could do that. Brody and I could be a couple living together. We got a bit lost walking back to the house, and once we were there, I washed fast and then collapsed on the armchair and fell asleep. I woke up, who knew when, with Brody nestled next to me and his hands all over me, ready for action. He was lifting my t-shirt over my head, unhooking my bra. I was doing my part in glee and reunion, rising to our bodily celebration, when I heard the sound of water running in the kitchen sink, and I knew then, with my eyes closed, that Brody had us performing for his friend. I went on with it anyway, but the arousal was like a bad dream, a friction with a burn to it. I did what I could to speed him on. I wanted it over. We were coiled in the armchair in a twisted pose that was hard on my bad leg, and when he collapsed against me, he said into my neck, "You liked that, didn't you?" If love requires adoration, then I had never really loved Brody, but everything about his body was very dear to me. What a simple life I'd tried to lead. "You're great," I said. Why was I afraid to make him angry? Maybe I just always took what I thought was the easy road. Russell was gone by the time we stirred ourselves and got up from the chair. He came back sometime later when we were trying to make a dinner out of hot dogs and bread and some cheese we found in the fridge. "The girl is a great cook," Brody said, offering him some. Russell chomped on it and said, "How long did you think you could stay here? What was your plan?" 5 or 6 years, Brody said. Russell didn't laugh. You have another day, he said. That's it. He offered recommendations. There was a Y, there was a homeless shelter, there were places you could camp, but you should not have anything valuable on you. You have each other, he said. I wasn't sure how ironically he meant that. You know, I have a friend in Phoenix, Brody said. We can hitch there. You never told me, I said. That's great. Plan B, he said, since some people don't know what friendship is. That night, in our big armchair, he was a force of nonstop ardor, a zealot of every orifice, more than ever before. I didn't forget that Russell was there on his mattress across the room. A flush of horror came and went, but I did what we were doing. I was used to it. And I thought that Phoenix would probably be better. The friend there lived in a big house with a great view, according to Brody. Good night, babe, he said when we were done, and he fell asleep in seconds with his weight on my chest. In what seemed like the middle of the night, I woke to feel Brody twisting around and getting up. By the time I opened my eyes, he was standing nearby, pulling on his pants. I'm going out to see the sunrise, he said. Sleep on, my girl, which I did. He wasn't there when I woke up, and I was glad to have the bathroom to myself, though I didn't hog the shower for too long. The little house was very quiet when I emerged. I thought it was very soulful of Brody to stay on after sunrise, still looking at whatever the vista was. Maybe I'd walk a little myself. I was looking for my baseball hat. Everybody said you needed a hat here. But I couldn't find our backpack, not anywhere. Had I put my hat in my shoulder bag? My bag was on the floor with its contents spilling out. My wallet was still there, right on top, and I could see immediately that the billfold was empty. I was suddenly very afraid that a robber had come while we were sleeping, and I wanted to tell Brody, as if Brody weren't gone. I went back to the bathroom to check. No Brody shampoo, no Brody shaving cream. He'd made a clean sweep. In the kitchen, there was a note on the table. Looks like your asshole boyfriend is gone. I'm at work. See you later. Here's a key. Do not leave the door unlocked if you go out. R. There wasn't much food left. 3 slices of bread, 2 slices of cheese. And that was the moment when I couldn't stand it. I was weeping, little soft sobs that turned louder. I heard myself howl. Brody had left me without anything in the middle of nowhere. Brody whose penis had been in every portal of my body. Brody whose skin I'd licked and loved the taste of, whose smell was in my clothing. I took Russell's key and walked outside, past trees with branches like gnarled fans, and houses the color of sand and rust. But I didn't get very far in the heat, without a hat, too. Where had Brody looked at any sunrise? I was heading back, and I knew what I was going to do. My mother was at the library at her job, but she'd be home by 6, which was 3 here, and I could call her collect. I'd given my mother a bad scare, and I was sorry now. I got the door to Russell's house unlocked, which wasn't easy, and when I went back inside, I was hoping that Brody would be there, but of course he wasn't. How could I keep on longing for him? Well, I could. I knew he had dishonored the power of our bodies by running away. I'd stayed faithful to my beliefs. I buoyed myself with this truth while I waited for Russell to get home. My poor mother. Russell had been home for a while. He'd been grouchy but had fed me some spaghetti. When I finally tried phoning her, "Oh, Kara," she said when she heard my voice, "why did you do this?" She had pestered and plagued Nini, who would say only we were on the road. She had called Brody's family, He thought he was at a friend's, but weren't sure. She had called the police, who took the details, but said it was difficult to track runways across state lines. "You're okay," she said. "Tell me how you are." "I'm totally okay, I'm fine," I said. And she knew how to send me a MoneyGram. She knew how to buy me a plane ticket that I could pick up. She knew how to get me out of there. "You'll be home soon, sweetie," she said. "Arizona's not a bad state," I said. "Oh, Kara," my mother said. So I'm going to skip ahead so I don't take too much time. She does come home, and her mother's not pleased with her, but, of course, greets her. And she brags to all the other school kids about, what a great trip she had. My mother was afraid I was going to escalate, take off into drugs and crime, dare myself into bigger trouble. And I might have, but I didn't. Not then. Why didn't I? I was still hungry for Brody for a long time, and I wasn't sure I liked anything else. I knew perfectly well that he was an asshole. I'd sort of always known it. But I thought that what we'd had was a tremendous thing in its way. It had taken me more than 2,000 miles across the country. It had caused me to sleep on the ground, on benches, on chairs, without even minding. It had led me to eagerly slip into dozens of vehicles driven by strangers. It had its own unsaid beauties of feeling. I didn't have to call it love, and I didn't. But even as I thought pretty poorly of him, I believed it was something I'd been through. I believed it was something. I'd been through my days and nights of initiation, testing my mettle, and I took pride in that. I had now passed beyond a lot of what was around me. I'm going to just skip ahead to the last part. So she goes off to college in California. She has a relatively normal life, and she likes California. And then she comes home for Christmas break, and she goes back to the donut store that she once worked in, what is by now a few years before. I fondly walked by my old high school, even stopped by the donut shop on 8th Street that had once been rash enough to employ me. My old boss, Ronald, was behind the counter, a little balder and more creased. "Look at you," he said. "You were a pipsqueak when I saw you last, and now you're a grown woman." "How's it been going without me?" I said. Business was down. 8th Street wasn't what it once was, but he was always glad to see his old workers. Crullers weren't selling. Did I want one? I did. "It was so sad about Brody, wasn't it?" he said. What? Brody had never been completely out of my thoughts, and I used to guess how far he'd hitched and where he had ended up. Las Vegas? Baja? Ronald, who couldn't get over my not knowing, "I thought you two were friends," finally got to the sentence about how Brody had been killed some years ago when he drove through a stop sign right into another car somewhere in Maine. Brody had a car in Maine? "I thought you two were friends," Ronald had to say again. And then I was walking down 8th Street with a cruller in my hand. My first thought was to be stuck with remorse for the mean things I'd said in our fights. "Brody, I'm sorry." And my next thought was to want back what he'd stolen, my hat that I had liked and the favorite scarf that had been in the backpack. No Brody to blame anymore. Brody was gone. How could it be that even if I'd never planned to see him again, our story was a different story now? He'd been dead for years without my even knowing, which made me feel ignorant and shallow. And I'm just going to, I'm sorry I've gone over a little bit. I'm just going to kind of race you forward to the end. We get to see her as an older person, but now she's remembering back to when she was 10. When I was 10 and jumping around on the fire escape, doing my foxy little moves, what did I think I was doing? As my mother asked. Putting on my power, that's what I thought. I remembered Nini wailing to her mother that I was dead. Ha ha, I wasn't. But I was taken to the land of the dead, that demented emergency room. My mother tried to edge me away from the worst, the bleeding and the ranting. Later, I told Nini it was all very interesting. I acted as if I'd wanted to know everything, though I didn't. Who does? When I was back in school with my plaster cast with all the signatures on it, I'd look at those names and feel superior for having been in that room with this evidence of what the body was. I believed my tibia would grow back fine. I was a confident girl. But bone didn't last forever, did it? I kept this question to myself, as if no one were in on the mystery but me. Thank you. And I should stay up here to answer questions? Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Come
Good.
over here. Sit down in this wax right. Oh. Thank you for that reading. You're always so good about, I love what you said about sex was different then. You know, it meant something different. You're so good at eras.
Oh, well, I was very aware of that with this story, that we think of, I mean, everybody thinks they invented sex, but we also think of it as eternal. It's something that humans always do. And her friend Nini says at one point that sex, because she's studying anthropology, she says that something like sexual behavior is a social construct. And I think we never think that. I mean, you never think I'm acting on a social construct by hopping in bed with these guys. But it is very different in every era. And once I thought of that and working on this story, that was what I really wanted to talk about. You know?
It's wonderful hearing her thoughts about sex, because they wouldn't be, I don't think they would be the thoughts of a millennial.
Me Too hadn't
Yeah,
happened.
Me Too hadn't happened, and even things between. It's really wonderful to remember that.
She's so proud of her daring
Yeah.
that it minimizes everything else.
Yeah, and she is daring. I mean,
Yeah.
many people would have been home well before Pennsylvania. I mean,
Yes.
I love the mother in this story too. She's just sort of implacable and there and dismayed.
The mother makes an appearance later on in another part of the novel, and her father, who got cut out of this story, is kind of a hippie father who hasn't been home since she was little, but who lives in Bali. So we get to visit him when he's old.
You said this novel is a little bit more you said this one is a little bit more novelistic
Yeah.
than the last few.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Was that intentional, or it just grew that way?
It grew that way. It has two sort of casts of characters in a way. It has the cast around Kara. There's like three pieces around those characters. And then there's the cast around the two guys who were in the emergency
hospital.
room. In the hospital, yeah.
And is that their only point of convergence? Is her being in the hospital when that happened?
I think so.
I love the way you do that. It's so cool. There's one thing I wanted. Sorry. Oh, Claudia. Is your microphone?
It's on. Just hold it closer.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, I will speak up.
Right by
Sorry.
your mouth, if possible.
Did people hear what I said before? Was it okay. I'll hold it closer. Sorry.
One thing I wanted to, one thing we talked about when Joan generously talked to the students earlier, is it seems when you look at Joan's career, it seems just like an uninterruptedly triumphant career, you know. But then you spoke of your 13 years when you didn't publish. Can you talk about the sort of what internal fortitudes you relied on, what kept you going during that time?
Yeah, that's really the question, isn't it? Between my second book and third book, I couldn't get a book published for 13 years. And I wrote one novel that was fortunately not published, I think now, but wasn't good. But then I couldn't get off the ground. So I think
You couldn't get off the ground. You were starting things, but you just couldn't.
I was starting things and not. I think there were other things that were discarded, and then it took a long time. The next thing that was published was a collection of stories that took a while to write. But I was dedicated. I don't think I did think of. Oh, actually, I've left out parts of this story, which I will tell now. There were a couple of things I did during this time. I thought maybe I am done being a writer, so I should have other, and it was, teaching writing was becoming difficult because, I'm teaching this thing that I have not been successful at. So I did think, so I had a couple of different ideas, some of which were good and some of them were bad. The one that didn't work was I thought maybe I could work as an interpreter for the deaf. I don't know, American Sign Language, but it seemed, it's always looks so wonderful when you see people doing it. I mean, it really, and I thought, that would be, it would be a great thing to do. I'm not very visual, so when I started to take classes in it, I was a total bust. I'm normally sort of okay with languages, and this one I was like the worst in the class. I was really terrible. So there went that idea. And then I had two other ideas that were good. I was gradually getting interested in Buddhism bit by bit, and I got more serious about it during this time. And the other thing was, this was in the 90s, early to late 90s, and late 80s to 13 years. And I became a buddy for Gay Men's Health Crisis, which was it was a program they had then where you volunteered to help someone who had AIDS, and you showed up once a week and did errands for them. You were just there helping the buddy. And I was with one guy for 2 years who died at the end of 2 years, and then I was with a woman for the next, 18 years.
Wow.
And one thing that does is, of course, you think you've got problems, So it really did set my life in a different container in a way, and was helpful to me in ways I wouldn't have anticipated.
Were you still teaching writing through all of that?
Yeah.
At Sarah
I did
Lawrence?
so, yeah.
That's cool. I think that's good to hear, because it from the outside,
I don't know how I kept writing. That part, I just did it. I didn't even talk about it so much anymore. I would sometimes meet people on the street who would say, "Are you still writing? I haven't seen anything of yours in a while." But mostly people didn't ask, and I didn't volunteer my comments on it.
Did it give you any kind of freedom, you think?
Oh, I think that when I went back to it, I think that there were two books that were kind of transitional books in between, I would say. But when I went back to writing stories, then I got the idea of doing these weird link stories, which, trust me, nobody wanted me to do. And I was definitely in a stage where I was thinking, nobody cares what I do or not. I can do whatever I want to do. So someone had told me a very complicated story that I wanted to use. And I used that, and then that led to a sequence of stories that were linked. But there was a freedom. Yeah, yeah.
So in a way, it ended up being a great gift, a hard gift, but one that got you onto this new...
I wouldn't use the word gift. Do you know what I mean? But opportunity, maybe.
Opportunity, which you made the best of.
Yeah, it caused the work to deepen in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise, and it also caused me to feel freer about trying different forms, I think. Yeah.
It's always interesting because there's so many lacunae in these stories, because you'll have somebody in one period and you won't have them in many other periods of their life. So I always wonder, if you sort of started with more and took out, or if you put more in.
I think both. In this story, I didn't have more. That was sort of written with pretty much the material. And some of it got cut, actually, when it was published, but I didn't have too much more.
But there's much more of her in the book. Is there more of her?
There's a little more of Kara, yeah.
Is there more of her mother?
There's a little of her mother, and Kara has two daughters, and one of the daughters carries one of the stories. So, yeah.
And no more about him. He's gone.
Oh, yeah, Brody's gone, right. I killed him off. But also I wanted, this book has a lot of sort of thoughts about death in it in the way that they're in this story. They're not gruesome. But I wanted, and in fact, when it was about to be published, the story was in the New Yorker, which made me totally thrilled. It had been 30 years since they had published the stories of mine, so that's another message, right? All this can happen. But when I looked at it again, I wrote to the editor, this should be called Sex and Death. That's what this story is. And he said, he said, let's wait to see if we want to, like, let's not jump on that idea right away. He didn't say no, immediately. But it is, because it's about the body. I mean, those are the two major comments about it, right? So that's one of the reasons that I killed Bertie off. I needed to do that.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful, it's very satisfying somehow that he's dead.
Yes, yes, in all ways, in all
In
ways.
all
Right.
ways.
Got rid of him, yeah.
What a character,
Yeah.
really something. He seems like a character of his time as well.
Yes, absolutely. He wouldn't have questioned his own behavior at the time.
No,
Yeah.
no, and nobody else seems to question it too much. His
Yeah.
friend a little bit,
Yeah.
says your asshole boyfriend.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
no, it's incredible too, like just, it's a good measure because I completely believed her behavior. And yet, looking at it now, we do question, why is she doing,
Yeah,
why
yeah.
is she allowing her back to get hurt, It's kind of fascinating.
And I think, every era has its own assumptions, and they're never enough to cope with what life is. So, we have our own now, and I'm not going to enumerate them because I don't think I know them that clearly. But life is always going to be more complicated than our ideas about it. So,
For sure.
Yeah, and fiction loves that. That's where fiction loves to come in. Where
Yeah.
your ideas are failing you and real life is presiding something else.
And it's kind of, I think fiction definitely takes advantage of all those nuanced changes in human behavior. And the way she was a child of her time, and it was totally normal to do that. It was totally normal to reverence sex so much that any suffering for it was almost honorable. Whereas a child of 2024 would not feel that way.
Right.
And fiction is good with that too, because it's always fresh. There's always a new cultural norm. So I could go on all night, but I know a lot of the audience members have questions as well. So if you don't mind, raise your hands, but then, yes, let's start with you, but wait till you get a microphone, because we do tape these sessions.
Hi. You mentioned earlier when you were learning sign language that you're not like a very visual person.
Right.
So when you are writing, do you think more in, this is kind of a random question, but do you think more in like words, or do you see what's happening, or you know what I mean, like?
I think a lot in terms of dialogue, actually.
Oh, okay.
And also in impression. So we hear what she thinks about what's going on. So I probably think a lot in interior monologue when I'm, and I do make characters fairly aware. They're not wise. I wouldn't say she was wise, but she knows what's going on. So I'm interested in that, like the bargains that she makes with herself about it, for instance. And that comes up in a lot of stuff that I write, those moments where the perceived and the expected are different, and she gets to think about it. So, it's not that I totally avoid visual stuff, but it's not the primary part for me.
It's nice when the narrator seems wiser than the character, like when she says she was about her mother, she was right about that. That skipping school wasn't such a great idea. More questions, please. Let's have a microphone here.
Hello again. Earlier today at UCLA, you mentioned that you never name your characters based off of intimate friends that you have,
Right,
and I was really
right.
struck by that. What is it about the intimacy that makes you,
Well,
not want to name them?
I don't want to think of the real person.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally made up Kara, right? She's not modeled on anyone I've known. There's some, it's like acting the part of a character. There's some affinity, her feelings are feelings I understand, but I'm not her, and she isn't anyone I know. So I don't want to confuse them. There are enough names in the world for me to find a name that I can use for her that doesn't belong to someone in my life. They don't like it either. It would be rude to do that too, I think. Yeah.
Have you ever mistakenly, how do you know they don't like it either? Did you ever mistakenly name someone who took offense?
I'm trying to think. Not by name. I mean, my people have known that they were characters, and like the first book I wrote, there's a very passing mention of the main character's brothers, who were modeled on my real life uncles, and they knew, and aunts. I mean, brothers are married, and they joked a little bit about it, like, "Oh, I wouldn't want to have you after me," you know. So, you know, they're aware of that, but I haven't done anything horrendous as far as I know.
I remember Alice McDermott said that with one of her novels, her mother said, well, I know it's not me, but how are the neighbors going to know that it's not me?
Yeah.
There's also that.
There's no way to fight that, right?
There's
Those
no way to
neighbors,
fight that.
those neighbors, right?
It's the life of a writer. More questions, please. Yes, can we have a...
Hi, so I was wondering, what do you think was gained by showing the narrator like different snapshots of her life rather than just having her look back on everything as an older person?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
What do you think was gained by like showing the narrator like different snapshots at like different stages of her life rather than just like letting her talk all about it as an older person?
I like to do that, particularly as I get older and my sense of life is longer. I often like to show them younger and older. In the case of her, seeing her as a 10-year-old, you know, running around on the fire escape, it gives us, her daring is what gets us into trouble. What gets her into trouble twice in this story, once on the fire escape and once, you know, with Brody. But I also, in this case, I needed it for the novel because the guys she sees in the emergency room are guys who are the principal players in the rest of the book. So it had two purposes that way. But I like moving around in time. I've often done that to some extent, and it's quite. I don't know. I think my sense of what life is has to do with long periods of time being involved. I never liked the idea that everything happens in one scene and that changes everything forever. I mean, it's just not a belief. I don't think it's wrong, but it's just not my belief. So I think your beliefs come out in what you write. And the sense of things happening over long periods of time is probably close to me.
So in a way, you really do, even though you're writing these novels which are in this new form you've created, they are really novels, because that is a novelist's idea of time rather than a short story writer's.
Yeah. Although I had one essay on long times in short stories because I thought you could do it in stories, but it's harder.
I was thinking of the Joan wrote a brilliant book about time in fiction, and one thing you cite is the fabulous lists in The Great Gatsby. And I was thinking of that with in Kansas, in Pennsylvania, you used that technique very well, I thought.
I love those lists on Gatsby.
Yeah,
really
no,
do.
that's very,
Yeah.
and it was very effective in this story too. In this place, in this place, in this place, you get a sense of their movement across the country. Another question. Don't be shy. No more questions? Oh, there's one. Then there's one too.
Hi. This is kind of loud. Was there any character when you were writing the book that particularly drew you into like actually creating a more like cement story? I know obviously you said you like your two set of main characters, but was there like any like side character that for some reason you just like were really drawn to and kind of like allowed you to build off of the other characters even if they weren't like the main character or something?
Say that again. I'm getting.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Was there like a character that you were really interested in? Like randomly, it sparked some idea to write about this person. Like, who like came first from when you were writing the novel from the list of characters? Did you kind of like make just the character list like all and then write about them, or was it like, did it come in phases and did you have to like go back and?
It happens as I'm writing because I have this idea I mean, in this one, oh, I'll send Kara across the country with this guy, and then, of course, all this stuff got invented that I didn't know to begin with. So it's in the process that stuff happens. But the question of what attaches us to a character, I think, is really interesting. Fiction writers want characters to get into trouble, right? So I'm gonna in some way be drawn to characters who get themselves into trouble for reasons that I'm interested in. I mean, Kara's daring is appealing, even though I would be horrified if a young person I was close to behaved that way, right? I'd be more hysterical than her mother is. But I think that's a part of it, and I probably, the same way I said my values are sort of hidden in things, they're hidden in that, in the way that, the characters get, you can sort of tell who the writer likes, right? And who they're hard on. Like, no one would say, oh, she really likes Brody, doesn't she? No, you wouldn't have that sense. There is some,
You're not really hard on him either.
No, I don't hate him.
No.
Well, I do, kind of. But, no, it's not.
It's not that apparent. I mean,
but he's not praised by the, we like her better and he's injured her.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. It's an interesting question because you never know what. I don't really write super timid characters, I think. I think they're bad fictionally and I'm too frustrated with them. And that's probably true in real life. I don't like people who are too timid or too afraid of things. Do you know what I mean?
on the other hand, like what Hessa says, you were saying when you were in high school, you were faithfully attending classes.
Yeah.
Well, as a 15-year-old, you weren't running off with some guy.
Right.
Isn't there some way in which there is an alter ego?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
I mean, you're
Yeah.
living vicariously through. Don't
Yeah.
we all wish we'd been a little bit
Yeah.
more like that, perhaps?
I think that the one thing that everybody has in common with their characters is that their impulses are theirs in some way. So we may not have told those lies, but we wanted to tell lies like that. The same way actors are drawing on their own emotions when they play a particular character. And also, I feel that, the most important thing in my stories is the characters. So, which is not true of all writing. I mean, there are different ways to write fiction and different points of emphasis. So that's been important to me, too.
What I think you were asking a little bit too about the chronology of inspiration. Like, for example, you started with her story, right? Did you, from the very beginning, have her meet those guys in the hospital, the one who died?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
So
I
that's
wanted someone to be in the hospital room when
Interesting.
they were, and to tell some story from that point of view. Because I have nothing in this story is my own experience, except I've been in the emergency rooms with friends in those eras when they were totally chaotic. So I had a sense of wanting to plant a character there, and then she developed her own story as I was doing it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, you had a question over here.
And I think you just answered my question. So I was going to ask how you journeyed with her. I think you've really just addressed that. How you discovered her. If you wanted worse things to. I mean, there was a kind of sense as an older person of some kind of like whiff of dramatic irony. I don't even want to use that word, but we feel a little protective of her, and there's also a kind of enjoyment perhaps that we know more than she does. Let me get it back to a question though. Did you have to pull back? I mean, I feel like you've already really covered this, so you can either ignore this question or take it and run with it.
I should say one thing, just as a sort of general thing, since so many of you are writers, is it's very much trial and error. So it's not like I decide to do something and I do it and it's fine. I have this idea and then that idea, and then, so I'm constantly changing and correcting. I revise as I write, which of course you used to always be told not to do. And I think any way you do it that seems to move your work forward is fine. But I probably know less of what I'm doing as I go along than a lot of writers do. I might know the ending, but I don't know how I'm going to get there. But I like that. Not always, but I like the process of coming to understand it as I'm going through it.
Can I ask just one question about who reads your work as you're as you're ongoing, how does that work? You have one reader?
I have
mainly,
one
you said?
reader, I have a very close friend, who was a writer but doesn't write so much now, and may again. But she understands what I want to do. So she'll say, you know, you need a little more of that, or that part isn't clear, or I would say I err on the side of being too moderate and too underdeveloped, and sometimes a little muddled, in that I want to mean like 3 things at once, and that's not really going to work. And she helps clarify it without, you know, vulgarizing it in any way. That's why she's a trusted reader.
Yeah, that's
not,
great.
Not that, also I don't have to do it, you know, it's just a friend, it's not
Right.
anyone enforcing anything.
Would you say that that's a more important voice than your editor? Or just,
I've never had an editor who really edited that much. They make little suggestions and stuff like that. The most editing I had was actually on this story for the New Yorker, because he cut a lot. And I thought most of his ideas were good. Not all, but most of them were good. But usually nobody really edits
Right.
once it's past a certain point.
right.
Yeah.
Any more questions? We have time for maybe one more. Yes. Well, maybe we can do 2. We'll do 2.
I thought someone,
Yasser?
I thought somewhere in there.
Oops, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so in the ending, or not the ending, but I guess the climax, takes place in Arizona, which, you know, to varying people, to varying degrees, could be a very interesting place or could be a very boring place. Just the state of Arizona, just the desert and stuff. I grew up in a desert kind of town, so like, but I think it's a really interesting setting, because when you have something that's like maybe not as vibrant as where we start off with, you know, the fire escape and stuff like that, just the city, like you can focus more on characters. But I feel like you don't really treat it like that. Like Arizona, like I was very invested in like the adobe house and like the idea of like God and like how like nature, like they all kind of correlate together. So I guess my question is like, how do you like, it might be a bit of a hard question because like it's very specific, but how do you find that balance where like you build a setting that's like interesting enough to captivate your readers, but it doesn't take away from the characters that you're kind of like trying to explore in those settings? If that
Oh,
makes
that's a
sense.
really good question. I think that's true of a lot of things, because you can get very carried away with developing something and you know, you forgot about the story already. I have friends in Tucson whom I visit a lot, so it's a place I knew what it looked like and so forth. But I did want it to be someplace, I wanted her to have to go all the way across the country to get there, and it to be a place she doesn't know how to deal with. But I probably, I mean, the cure for when I get too carried away about, let me show you this cactus, is to cut. You know what I mean? You're going to let yourself be excessive, and then the trick is to hear it and say, well, no, I don't need. They don't need to know what kind it is. You know. So again, it's trial and error. It's trying it out and seeing what resonates and what doesn't. So it was very important that it be, or it was somewhat important that it be hot and uncomfortable, you know. And also they had to have the one-room house. I mean, that's part of her humiliation, that they have no privacy. So all of that was in the, but you're guessing. You're always guessing and then trying this and trying that. And it never comes out the way it's going to be in the end.
And I know there's a question here, but while the microphone is coming, let me just ask, and when you revise going along, do you know, like 3 days later, whether it's working or not? I mean, when you say it's trial and error, do you know what's working? Is it the passage of time in a couple days?
It depends. I mean, sometimes it takes a really long time, and sometimes I know like the next day. So it just varies. You know.
Okay, Tara, we'll give you a microphone.
In the talk at UCLA, I know someone mentioned how beautifully you integrate culture, especially in the first chapter of Improvement that we read in the workshop, and also in this book too, with the ideology of like the Balinese Hindus that you mentioned at the end. I was wondering, since you also mentioned that you traveled a lot, like 3 times to Turkey, and then you also mentioned your travels to India and Thailand, do you find the experiences in your travels also inspire a lot of the stories and characters you create?
Oh, absolutely. And one thing that is interesting to me, because it's so random, is there are places that I've loved, like Japan, which I've been to a few times. I had a friend who had grants to be there, and I would be like, hi, here I am. But I never wrote about that, because I didn't, in some ways I felt under-equipped to use it. It's such a deep, complicated culture, and maybe didn't have a ready use for it. So it's very hard to know. I mean, I love to travel anyway, but I don't know what's gonna. And I want people to go different places. I want that the same way she's just tested by going to Arizona, you know. But I don't know what it's going to be until I've come back. I don't usually have an idea in advance of what I need.
Okay, one more, Julia. Pass the microphone.
Okay, this is quick, but I just thought of this. You've written so many books over so many years. Do you still think about the characters and their worlds from the first books that you wrote? Like, do they
That's a good
still live
question.
in your head? Do you still live with them?
That's so interesting. No, I think is the short answer. Because people used to always say, oh, don't you want to write about so-and-so again? And I was like, who? I really, you know, it's like going from one relationship to another. It's actually quite a bit like that. And that it's not that you've forgotten. I mean, I can talk about, you know, prior books, but it is that now I'm involved with this, you know. So it's sort of, it has definitely slipped away from me, you know.
That's a good place to end. Joan, Joan has graciously agreed to sign books, so you can arrest her with questions while we're signing. Thank you so much.
Great group. Thank you so much.